I'm Summer Savage, and this is my Deaf Cultures presentation on one community, an examination of the various communities within the deaf community. The first thing that I want to talk about today is oppression. It is invisible as it is visible. A lot of people think of oppression as something that is very outright, very discriminatory, very, in your face, and that's not always the case. Oppression can look like keeping certain people out of certain spaces just because, you underestimate their abilities to do certain things, or you assume that they have a disability when they don't just because they look a certain way. And so those are some of the ways that oppression is invisible. Oppression is also found in everyday language, just based on the way that assumptions people make and, the things that they may say about people offhandedly without even realizing it. Some differences in deaf culture versus American culture include the language that we use, ASL versus American General English, and our classroom setups. So, a lot of American classrooms are just set in rows and with the teacher at the front of the class versus a deaf class is particularly going to be set up in a circle. Some of the stories that we tell are different, such as American folklore include like Johnny Appleseed, stuff like that, versus deaf culture folklore includes that story about Aith. And then the events that we attend, obviously Americans, are very into the Olympics and football. Deaf communities also have these sporting events. They just may be set up a little bit differently. Culture impacts our everyday life in a few different ways. Some biases that we might have against people based on, the way that they keep their personal hygiene, the way that they keep their house, some customs that they might have. And our customs are obviously going to shape our everyday life. The way that we communicate is going to shape our everyday life, and that's part of our culture. The way that we greet people, the way that we say goodbye. And then our familial roles. So the typical nuclear family within the American culture is very set out, versus in other cultures it might not be so rigid, it might not be so clear-cut. Some key deaf history figures and events that I have really come to enjoy are Marlee Matlin, Thomas Gallaudet, the Deaf President movement of 1988, and the movement of deaf schools. Marlee Matlin is a famous deaf actress. She is a deaf advocate. She has brought in a lot of attention to the topic of deaf culture and integrating that into everyday society and what that can look like in being inclusive. Thomas Gallaudet is the founder of Gallaudet University, which is, the biggest deaf university in the country. And in 1988, the students fought and peacefully protested in order to have a deaf president for their school, which obviously means a lot and was very heartwarming to see. That's probably one of my favorite deaf culture events. And then the integration of deaf schools into the United States and making that become more common, which this is also an interesting event in history because I recently read an article that said that this is actually starting to reverse with more cochlear implants becoming an everyday thing. Deaf schools, their enrollment is actually decreasing currently. Obviously, within every community, there's going to be diversity, whether you're looking at the neurodivergent community, you're looking at, the blind community, deaf community, any sort of community, you're going to have diversity within that. And so I wanted to talk about a couple different branches of the diversity within the deaf community. The first branch being the deaf culture across race. Examining the Native American culture within the deaf culture, there has been a massive movement to keep plain Indian Sign Language alive, which isn't a very well documented language, so it's one that, people really need to advocate for and really need to fight to keep alive. And then the Black American culture within the deaf culture exhibits different dialects, such as the different signs that they use for school and copy within ASL. And it brings a very unique Black American take and perspective on the deaf community. Deaf culture can be seen also across various different identities. An interesting identity within the deaf culture is the LGBTQ identity, and this is because deaf cultures and LGBTQ cultures share a lot of different aspects, just because you can't really pass on the mentorship from generation to generation within either of these cultures, just because deafness is not always inherited, well, not usually inherited, and obviously neither is LGBTQ traits, versus things like socioeconomic status or race can be inherited along down with the culture. This can lead to both of these communities feeling a little bit isolated, just because they may not have someone in their immediate family who really understands their identity. Deaf people within the professional world, this can be seen with business owners, within various different professions and careers. It just goes to show that, seeing deafness as a disability wasn't exactly accurate, and it's more of just needing to change the way that things are done in order to suit the deaf person's abilities. And then I just wanted to include my own personal experiences that I've had while learning ASL within the deaf community and within the deaf culture. So I work in the food industry. I have tried to use my ASL a few times with deaf customers. I've had some very mixed reactions within this. I've had some people be a little bit confused as to what I'm trying to say. I've had some people be very upset with me for trying to sign with them because they actually didn't know sign language themselves. And I've had some people be very kind, very appreciative. It just really goes to show that not everyone understands your intentions all the time, and sometimes it can be very difficult to come across as having good intentions in a culture that you're not very familiar with. I've really only had one personal experience with someone within the deaf community, and this is when I had to interview someone for my ASL 1 class. I actually FaceTimed someone from out of state that my mom knew, and we had a very good conversation. He was very patient with me, very understanding, and I do think that the differences in these experiences were because the second person knew who I was, he knew my intentions, he understood that I was trying my best, he understood that I was still learning ASL, so I think he was able to apply a lot more patience to that conversation and be a lot more open-minded. Deaf culture status varies at the national level versus the global level. At the national level, deaf status is viewed as a minority, not a disability. Hearing screenings have increased the potential for language learning earlier within deaf children, and educational resources are becoming more accessible. Versus at a global level, some regions are doing a little bit more advanced things than the United States, and some are doing a little bit less advanced things. Regions such as Asian deaf cultures struggle to keep their identities alive. African regions may be at risk for lost identities because their languages go undocumented, kind of similar to the plain Indian Sign Language. And some regions, such as the Scandinavian regions, are actually home to richer education and more diverse programs than the United States. Minorities within minorities, such as the deaf culture, may feel unwelcome within their own community, such as people within a minority culture can still have bias towards other minorities, and sometimes when you are a minority within a minority, people are not very accepting of you being in their culture. The two different cultures may conflict, and you can also experience compound discrimination. Compound discrimination is essentially when an individual experiences multiple forms of discrimination simultaneously, which results in a cumulative and more often severe discrimination or disadvantage. And these are some of the resources I used. Thank you.